August 31st, 1943. 14,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The air is thin and cold. Lieutenant Saburo Kitahata banks his Mitsubishi A6M0 through a wall of cumulus, scanning the horizon for American bombers. His engine hums with the familiar whine he's trusted since the Philippines. For 2 years, this sound has meant survival, dominance, victory. Then he sees it. A silhouette emerging from the sun, larger than a wildcat, heavier. The wings are clipped, the fuselage thick. It doesn't maneuver like the clumsy Americans he's learned to outfly. It doesn't try. Instead, it dives, fast, controlled, purposeful. Kitahata pulls into a climbing turn, the Zero's legendary agility responding instantly. But the stranger doesn't follow his arc. It fires. 6 streams of .5 caliber tracers converge. The Zero shudders. Metal tears. Smoke pours from the cowling. Kitahata doesn't bail out in time. Somewhere over the Pacific, the rules of the war have just changed. The F-6F Hellcat has arrived, and the sky will never belong to Japan again. December 7th, 1941. The Mitsubishi A6M0 descended on Pearl Harbor like a falcon striking prey. American sailors looked up to see something they had never imagined. A Japanese fighter that could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange anything in the U.S. Navy's arsenal. The Zero wasn't just a machine, it was a statement. Japan had entered the modern age of warfare, and it had done so with a weapon that rewrote the rules of aerial combat. In the months that followed, the Zero carved a path of destruction across the Pacific. Over the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Java Sea, it dominated every engagement. American F-4F Wildcats, stubby, durable, but painfully slow, were shot down in droves. Pilots who survived reported the same thing. You couldn't turn with a Zero. You couldn't climb with it. If you tried, you died. The Zero's design was a masterpiece of engineering compromise. It sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for performance. Its Sakai radial engine, though only producing 940 horsepower, propelled an airframe so light it could turn inside any Allied fighter. Its 20mm cannons packed devastating punch. Its range, over 1,900 miles with a drop tank, allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, a feat unmatched by any fighter in 1941. But it was the pilots that made the Zero truly terrifying. Japan's naval aviators were among the most experienced in the world. Many had flown combat missions in China since 1937. They trained for years before seeing combat. They practiced aerobatics until maneuvers became instinct. They believed in Bushido, the warrior code that made surrender unthinkable and death in battle the highest honor. By mid-1942, American losses in the Pacific were staggering. At the Battle of Java Sea, Allied forces were annihilated. Over Darwin, Australia, Zeros escorting bombers shredded defending Wildcats. In the skies over Brno and China, American volunteer group pilots flying P-40s survived only by refusing to dogfight, diving, shooting, and running before the Zero could respond. Then came Midway, June 4th, 1942. 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom of the Pacific. With them went not just aircraft, but irreplaceable pilots. Japan's naval air arm had been built on quality over quantity, and at Midway, the math stopped working. The attrition had begun. Guadalcanal bled Japan further. From August 1942 to February 1943, the skies over the Solomons became a grinding meat grinder. Zeros still won individual dogfights, but the Americans kept coming. More planes, more pilots. Less experienced, perhaps, but learning fast. Japan's veteran pilots, men with thousands of hours and dozens of kills, started dying. There were no replacements. Training programs couldn't keep pace. The Zero remained deadly, but the men flying them were growing younger, greener, more desperate. By early 1943, the United States Navy understood a brutal truth. The Wildcat was not enough. Brave men flew it. Skilled men died in it. If America was going to take the offensive, push across the Pacific and reach Japan itself, it needed a fighter that could meet the Zero on equal terms and beat it. Not through luck, not through courage, through superior design, firepower, and industrial might. The contract went to Grumman, Aircraft Engineering. The mission was simple and impossible. Build a fighter that could kill Zeros.
Grumman's engineers began with data, captured Zero fragments, debriefs from surviving pilots, intelligence reports from China and Australia. They studied the Zero's strengths and hunted for its weaknesses. What emerged was not an attempt to outmaneuver the Zero. That was a losing game. Instead, Grumman decided to out-engineer it. The F-6F6 Hellcat, designated XF-F6F1, took its first flight on June 26, 1942. It was not elegant. It was not light. It was a brute. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generating 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's output, the Hellcat was built for speed and durability. Its airframe was armored. The cockpit was protected by bulletproof glass and steel plating. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. It carried 6 .5 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each loaded with over 400 rounds. Where the Zero was a sword, the Hellcat was a sledgehammer. But the Hellcat was more than metal and firepower. It was a philosophy. American doctrine had evolved. Pilots were trained not to dogfight Zeros, but to dictate the terms of engagement. The Thatch weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, allowed two fighters to cover each other in a scissors maneuver, negating the Zero's turning advantage. Boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, firing, and climbing away before the Zero could react, exploited the Hellcat's superior speed and power. American training pipelines expanded exponentially. In 1941, the U.S. Navy graduated a few hundred pilots a year. By 1943, that number had ballooned into the thousands. These men weren't aces. They weren't veterans, but they were drilled relentlessly in standardized tactics. They flew with discipline. They fought as teams, not lone samurai. And they had something the Japanese didn't: an endless supply of replacements. Meanwhile, Japan's situation deteriorated. Industrial capacity, already stretched thin, couldn't match American output. In 1943, Grumman produced over 2,500 Hellcats. Mitsubishi built fewer than 750 Zeros. Japanese pilot training was cut from years to months, then months to weeks. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 hours of flight time, less than a tenth of what their predecessors had before Pearl Harbor.
The strategic chessboard was shifting. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping campaign moved inexorably westward. Each captured atoll brought American bombers closer to Japan. Each carrier task force brought more Hellcats. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was being pushed into a defensive crouch. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots became irreplaceable treasures, husbanded carefully, unable to train the next generation because they were needed at the front. The Hellcat entered combat in late August 1943, first over Marcus Island, then in support of the Gilbert Island invasion. Early reports were cautious. Pilots praised its toughness, its firepower, its stability as a gun platform. But the real test was yet to come. The question wasn't whether the Hellcat could survive a fight with a Zero. The question was whether it could dominate. By autumn 1943, Japanese commanders began noticing something disturbing in pilot reports. Encounters with the new American fighter were ending badly. Zeros that had always dictated the terms of combat were being bounced from above, shredded before they could respond, or simply outrun when they tried to engage. The psychological impact was immediate. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the sky. Now, for the first time, they felt hunted. The industrial machine behind the Hellcat was relentless. Grumman's factories in Bethpage, New York, operated around the clock. Assembly lines refined production techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Each Hellcat took less time to build than the last. By 1944, Grumman was delivering nearly 500 Hellcats per month. Japan's entire annual Zero production wouldn't match a single quarter of Hellcat output. The American pilot pipeline mirrored this industrial miracle. Flight schools across the United States churned out aviators by the thousands. They trained on vast open ranges in Texas and Florida, flying hundreds of hours before they ever saw combat. They learned gunnery, navigation, formation flying, and critically, how to exploit the Hellcat's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. They studied captured Zeros. They practiced against instructors flying simulated Zero tactics. By the time they reached the Pacific, they were ready. The stage was set, the weapon was forged, the tactics were refined. All that remained was the crucible of combat. And in the skies over the Pacific, that crucible was waiting. In early 1942, the average Japanese carrier pilot had over 800 flight hours and years of training. They were samurai of the sky, masters of their craft, confident to the point of arrogance. By late 1943, that had collapsed. New Zero pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with barely 100 hours of flight time, less than a tenth of what their predecessors had before Pearl Harbor. Across the battle line, American pilots were still relatively inexperienced compared to the 1942 Japanese elite, but the gap was closing fast. Hellcat pilots had 300 to 400 hours before deployment. They trained in realistic conditions. They flew mock combat daily. And critically, they had institutional knowledge, tactics refined through blood and survival, passed down from the few Wildcat veterans who'd survived the early war. This disparity created a paradox. The Zero was still, plane for plane, a formidable machine in a turning fight. But wars aren't fought by machines alone. A skilled Hellcat pilot facing a green Zero pilot wasn't a fair fight. It was an execution. And as 1943 turned into 1944, the ratio of skilled American pilots to skilled Japanese pilots inverted catastrophically in Japan's favor.
The Zero was born of scarcity. Japan lacked the industrial base to produce thousands of heavily armored, fuel-guzzling fighters. So it built a scalpel, light, efficient, deadly in the right hands. The trade-off was vulnerability. A single .5 caliber hit could rupture a fuel tank, ignite the aircraft, and immolate the pilot. The Zero demanded perfection. One mistake, and you burned. The Hellcat was born of abundance. America could afford weight. It could afford armor plating, self-sealing tanks, redundant systems. The Hellcat could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. Pilots returned to carriers with wings shredded, engines smoking, hydraulics dead, and walked away. This wasn't luck. It was design philosophy. The Hellcat bet that survival mattered more than agility, and in the long war of attrition, that bet paid off. This philosophical divide extended beyond engineering. Japan's culture valorized the warrior's skill, the perfection of technique, the beauty of the blade. America valorized mass production, interchangeable parts, and overwhelming material superiority. In the sky, these cultures collided, and in that collision, the samurai met the assembly line. Early in the war, American pilots tried to fight Zeros on their terms. They pulled in tight turns, climbed steeply, attempted scissors maneuvers. They died. The Zero's turning radius was about 500 feet. The Wildcat's was closer to 800. Physics is undefeated. But doctrine evolved. The thatch weave, two planes flying a crisscrossing pattern, meant that any Zero chasing one American would fly into the guns of the other. Boom and zoom tactics leveraged altitude and speed. Dive, shoot, climb away. Never dogfight, never turn. The Zero's advantages disappeared. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio made these tactics devastatingly effective. It could climb at 3,500 feet per minute, faster than the Zero. Its top speed exceeded 380 miles per hour, nearly 50 miles per hour faster. In a dive, it was untouchable. Japanese pilots found themselves in a nightmare. They could see the Hellcat, but couldn't catch it. They could turn inside it, but couldn't bring guns to bear before it was gone. The Hellcat dictated every engagement, and Zeros could only react. Japan's war economy was collapsing under its own contradictions. Oil supplies dwindled as American submarines strangled convoy routes. Aluminum and steel were rationed. Aircraft factories, dispersed to avoid bombing, operated inefficiently. By 1944, Japan's aviation industry could barely produce 1,500 fighters per month across all types. Mitsubishi's Zero production peaked and began declining. Meanwhile, the United States was ramping up to absurd levels. Grumman alone built over 12,000 Hellcats between 1943 and 1945. Ford, General Motors, and Douglas produced tens of thousands more fighters, bombers, and transports. American factories didn't just outproduce Japan. They buried it in an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and ammunition. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about sustainability. When a Hellcat was shot down, another rolled off the assembly line within hours. When a Zero was lost, replacing it took weeks, if resources allowed. Japan entered a death spiral. Losses exceeded production, squadrons shrank, experienced pilots died without replacements, and green pilots died faster. The Hellcat was the hammer, but American industry was the anvil.
In 1942, Japanese pilots flew with supreme confidence. They believed in their aircraft, their training, their destiny. The Zero was invincible. They were invincible. That confidence drove aggression, and aggression won fights. By late 1943, that confidence was cracking. Radio intercepts captured Japanese pilots reporting new enemy fighters, very fast, heavily armed. Combat reports described Hellcats diving through formations, shredding Zeros, and escaping before retaliation. The invincibility myth shattered. Fear crept in. Pilots hesitated. They avoided combat when possible. Morale plummeted. American morale soared. Hellcat pilots knew they flew the superior machine. They trusted their training. They believed in victory. This psychological edge translated into combat effectiveness. Confident pilots took risks. They pressed attacks. They trusted their wingmen. Fear is contagious, but so is confidence. In the sky, the Americans now radiated it. Inside every Zero and Hellcat was a human being. Young men, most in their early 20s. They had families, dreams, fears. War reduced them to statistics, but they were never just numbers. Japanese pilots faced a unique horror. Their culture forbade surrender. Their training emphasized death before dishonor. When a Zero caught fire, common given the lack of protection, the pilot often chose to die in the cockpit rather than bail out and face capture. Some flew their burning aircraft into enemy ships, foreshadowing the kamikaze doctrine. The Zero wasn't just a fighter. For many, it was a coffin. American pilots, protected by armor and doctrine that valued survival, had a different calculus. They could bail out. They carried life rafts. Submarines and seaplanes rescued downed flyers. This wasn't cowardice. It was pragmatism. Dead pilots couldn't fly again. Rescued pilots returned to combat, their experience preserved. The Americans treated pilots as investments. The Japanese treated them as ammunition. The human cost of this divergence was staggering. Japan lost over 20,000 naval aviators during the war. Most were irreplaceable veterans, killed in 1942 to 1943. By 1944, the men flying Zeros were boys, some as young as 17, sent to die in a war already lost. The Hellcat didn't just kill machines, it killed a generation.
September 1st, 1943. The USS Yorktown launches her air group for strikes on Marcus Island. Among the fighters is VF-5, flying the new F-6F-3 Hellcats. Commander Charles Cromlin leads the sweep. The mission is reconnaissance in force, test the Hellcat in combat, engage enemy fighters, assess performance. At 11,000 feet, Cromlin's formation spots them, a dozen Zeros climbing to intercept. The Japanese pilots are aggressive, confident. They've seen Wildcats before. They know the Americans are clumsy at altitude. They expect victory. Cromlin doesn't dogfight. He doesn't turn. He pushes the throttle forward and dives, the formation holding tight. The Hellcats accelerate through 350 miles per hour, then 370. The Zeros try to follow, but their lighter airframes shudder in the dive. Cromlin pulls up sharply, his wingman covering. A Zero attempts a head-on pass. 6.5 caliber guns converge. The Zero disintegrates. The engagement lasts 4 minutes. VF-5 claims 6 Zeros destroyed. No Hellcats are lost. Cromlin's after-action report is clinical. Aircraft performed excellently. Superior speed and firepower decisive. Enemy fighters unable to engage effectively. This isn't a fluke. Over Tarawa in November 1943, Hellcats swarm Japanese bombers and their Zero escorts. The Americans dive from above, shred the bombers, and climb away before the Zeros react. Kill ratios skew heavily in favor of the Hellcat, sometimes 10 to 1, sometimes higher. Japanese pilots begin calling the Hellcat the Grumman Tombstone. At Rabaul, the Japanese stronghold in New Britain, the pattern repeats. Large-scale raids by American carriers bring waves of Hellcats. Japanese defenders scramble Zeros, but the fights are one-sided. American pilots use altitude, speed, and teamwork. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training, die in flames. By December 1943, Rabaul's air strength is gutted. Japanese command begins to realize the scope of the problem. The Zero, once the symbol of Japan's air dominance, is being systematically destroyed. Not by better pilots, although American skill is improving, but by a better system. The Hellcat, backed by industrial might, superior tactics, and sustainable training, is breaking the back of Japanese naval aviation. In Tokyo, planners understand that air superiority is slipping away. They accelerate production of newer fighters, the J-2M Raiden, the N-1KJ Shiden. But these are too few, too late. The Zero remains the backbone of Japanese air defense, and the Zero is being slaughtered. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The largest carrier battle in history is about to unfold. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands the mobile fleet. 9 carriers, over 400 aircraft. His plan is bold. Launch massive strikes against the American invasion fleet off Saipan, cripple it, and turn the tide of the Pacific War. Opposing him is Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet. 15 carriers, over 900 aircraft. The core of the American fighter force is the F-6F Hellcat. The pilots are ready, the planes are fueled, the radars are scanning. At 10 a.m., Japanese strike packages appear on American radar screens. The fighter directors scramble Hellcats. Over 200 launch within minutes. They climb to intercept altitude, stacking in layers from 15,000 to 25,000 feet. The Japanese attackers, Zeros, Judys, Jills, approach in ragged formations. Many pilots are inexperienced, some on their first combat mission. Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from Essex, dives into a formation of Zeros. His wingman follows. The .5 calibers roar. 1 Zero explodes. A second spins into the sea, trailing smoke. McCampbell doesn't hesitate. He climbs, reverses, dives again. Another Zero dies. The Japanese formation disintegrates. Across the engagement area, the slaughter is repeated. Hellcats bounce Japanese formations from above and behind. The Zeros, overloaded with drop tanks and burdened by green pilots, can't maneuver effectively. The bombers are sitting ducks. Within 30 minutes, the first Japanese strike wave is annihilated. Fewer than 30 aircraft survive to approach the American fleet. Anti-aircraft fire claims most of those. The Japanese launch a second wave, then a third, then a fourth. Each meets the same fate. The Hellcats are relentless. Pilots land, rearm, refuel, and launch again. Some fly 4 sorties in a single day. The kill tally climbs, 50, 100, 200. American pilots coin a grim nickname for the battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By sunset, the slaughter is complete. Japan has lost over 330 aircraft, roughly 75% of its carrier air strength. The Americans lose fewer than 30 planes, most to operational accidents. The kill ratio is 11-1. Some Hellcat squadrons claim ratios exceeding 20-1. But the losses go beyond aircraft. Japan loses over 200 irreplaceable pilots. These aren't rookies. Many are veterans, squadron leaders, the last remnants of the elite cadre that struck Pearl Harbor. Their deaths gut Japan's ability to defend the home islands. The mobile fleet retreats. It will never again pose a serious threat. In the cockpits of surviving Zeros, the pilots understand the sky no longer belongs to them. The Hellcat and the nation behind it has seized control. The war is not over, but its outcome is no longer in doubt.
The numbers tell a story of annihilation. By the end of World War II, the F-6H-6 Hellcat is credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter. Its overall kill-to-loss ratio is 19-1. In carrier operations, the figure is even higher. The Hellcat doesn't just win engagements, it dominates them so thoroughly that Japanese air power ceases to exist as a strategic force. For the Zero, the decline is precipitous. After the Marianas, Japanese carrier aviation is functionally destroyed. The few remaining carriers lack aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots. Zeros continue to operate from land bases, but they are increasingly obsolete. Newer American fighters, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, even improved Hellcats compound the mismatch. The Zero, once the apex predator of the Pacific, becomes prey. Japan's response is born of desperation, the kamikaze. If skill and technology can't win, perhaps fanaticism can. Starting in October 1944, Zero pilots are ordered to crash their aircraft into American ships. The reasoning is brutally simple. A bomb might miss, but a plane piloted directly into a target will not. The kamikaze isn't a tactic, it's an admission of defeat. The Hellcat proves effective even against kamikazes. Its speed allows it to intercept attackers before they reach the fleet. Its firepower shreds incoming aircraft at long range. Combat air patrols, stacked in layers around carrier groups, became slaughterhouses. Kamikazes occasionally break through, causing horrific casualties, but most die in flames before reaching their targets. The Hellcat's kill count climbs further. American momentum becomes unstoppable. With air superiority secured, the island-hopping campaign accelerates. Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island is covered by Hellcats flying from carriers offshore. Japanese defenders, unable to contest the skies, are pounded by bombs and naval gunfire. Ground forces advance with impunity. The Pacific War becomes a grinding march toward Japan. By early 1945, B-29 superfortresses begin bombing Japanese cities. The raids are escorted by long-range fighters, including Hellcats operating from escort carriers. Japanese interceptors scramble, Zeros, Jacks, Georges, but they are overwhelmed. The Hellcat pilots shoot them down in droves. Tokyo burns. Osaka burns. The home islands are defenseless. For the Zero pilots who survive, the final months of the war are a waking nightmare. Fuel is scarce. Maintenance parts don't exist. Replacement pilots arrive with suicidal orders and no training. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, later write of the despair that pervaded squadrons. We knew we could not win. We flew because we were ordered to. We died because there was no alternative. The disparity in resources becomes a chasm. In the first half of 1945, Grumman delivers over 3,000 Hellcats. Mitsubishi produces fewer than 1,200 Zeros. American squadrons operate at full strength, with reserves. Japanese squadrons are skeletons, sometimes fielding fewer than a dozen operational aircraft. The strategic equation is no longer balanced, it's inverted. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Hellcats flying from Essex, Bunker Hill, and Wasp sweep Japanese airfields daily.
Zeros attempt to defend, but most are destroyed on the ground or shot down during takeoff. American pilots report entire sorties without encountering enemy fighters. The sky is empty. Japan has run out of planes, pilots, and hope. Okinawa in April 1945 brings the largest kamikaze offensive of the war. Over 1,500 suicide planes attack the American fleet in waves. Hellcats intercept them around the clock. Pilots fly until exhaustion, land and fly again. The sea around Okinawa fills with burning wreckage. American ships suffer terrible losses, over 30 sunk, hundreds damaged, but the kamikaze offensive fails. The invasion succeeds. The Hellcat, once again, proves decisive. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. The war is over. The Zero, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, is grounded. Many are destroyed by their own pilots to avoid capture. Others rust on jungle airfields. A few are taken by the Americans as trophies, curiosities from a war that now belongs to history. The Hellcat's legacy is secure. It is the fighter that broke Japan's Air Force, enabled the American advance, and ensured victory in the Pacific. But for the men who flew it, the statistics are secondary. They remember the fear of the early war, the losses, the desperate learning curve. They remember friends who didn't come back. And they remember the moment, somewhere over the Solomon Islands or the Marianas or Okinawa, when they realized the tide had turned, when the Zero, once invincible, became just another target. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the memory is darker. They remember the superiority they once enjoyed, the confidence that evaporated, the grinding attrition that killed their comrades and their cause. They remember the Hellcat, not as an enemy, but as the instrument of their nation's defeat. In the end, the sky didn't belong to courage, or skill, or the warrior's code. It belonged to the side that could build more planes, train more pilots, and sustain the fight longer. The Hellcat won because America could afford to build 12,000 of them. The Zero lost because Japan couldn't. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter never was the most beautiful fighter of World War II. It lacked the Zero's elegance, the Spitfire's grace, the Mustang's sleek lines. It was blunt, heavy, utilitarian. But in the crucible of the Pacific War, beauty was irrelevant. What mattered was effectiveness, and on that measure, the Hellcat stands unmatched. The story of the Hellcat and the Zero is not merely a tale of technology. It is a story of philosophies in collision. The samurai and the industrialist, the sword and the factory, the individual and the system. Japan built a fighter that required perfection. America built a fighter that assumed imperfection and compensated with armor, firepower, and mass production. In the long calculus of war, the latter proved superior. There is tragedy here, on both sides. Young men climbed into cockpits, American and Japanese alike, knowing they might not return. Some died in flames over empty ocean. Others died in sight of home. Courage was not a monopoly of one side, nor was suffering. War is indifferent to virtue. What the Hellcat represents, ultimately, is the power of adaptation. America entered the war with inferior equipment and doctrine. It suffered catastrophic losses. But it learned. It studied the enemy. It built better machines. It refined tactics. It trained pilots, and in doing so, it turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Zero's pilots met the Hellcat and realized the sky had changed hands. That realization, born in smoke and fire over 1,000 forgotten patches of ocean, marked the beginning of the end. The war would grind on for 2 more years. Thousands more would die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The sky belonged to America, and in the vastness of the Pacific, under the endless blue, that made all the difference.
The war is over. The skies have fallen silent. From the ashes of the Pacific, 2 machines remain in memory, the Hellcat and the Zero, symbols of 2 nations, 2 philosophies, and the men who gave everything beneath the endless blue. History remembers the victors, but honors the brave on both sides. If this story moved you, if it made you see the past in a new light, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon to join us for more untold stories from the world's most defining battles. Thank you for watching. This was the Hellcat versus the Zero, where the samurai met the assembly line and the sky chose its master.